In the second part of this video, we're going to look at how you as a leader can lead your team by example, how you can set an appropriate standard, appropriate behaviors that you can expect others to follow. And one very famous example of a leader who did lead by example was that of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer and a freedom fighter. And he actually led millions and millions of people against British rule in India. Now, this was a regime that had caused a lot of poverty, a lot of suffering and death to millions of people. But not only was he able to lead a movement against British rule that was successful, he actually did it peacefully as well. So how could one person inspire that many people and inspire them to make such a substantial change, to actually remove British rule from India? Well, whilst he had many skills, one particular leadership skill and leadership practice he is well known for was leading by example. And famously, Gandhi said that an ounce of practice is worth more than tons of preaching. So demonstrating your own actions and your own behavior is worth more than just telling people about it. And Gandhi actually lived in poverty because he felt that if he was going to defend those that lived in poverty, he should live in poverty as well. Despite the fact that he was a very wealthy, successful man born into a very wealthy, successful family, he still went and lived in poverty so that he could lead by example. And we see in the modern world that people are not necessarily leading by example, and that can really dilute the message. If you think of all the very wealthy, famous billionaires and celebrities that live in 20,000 square foot mansions in Beverly Hills and fly their private jets all around the world, and then they tell us, the common folk, that, oh, you should use less plastic and you should care about the environment and your greed is causing global warming, etc. Now, they have a point. Global warming is a huge issue and we do need to do something about it. But the message gets lost when you're being preached to by someone who has so much more than you. It's difficult to take someone seriously when they're telling you about how you're greedy and you're causing climate change when they live in a house that uses 100 times as much water and energy as you do, and they fly a private plane all around the world. So it's very important that you do practice what you preach. And that's basically the concept of leading by example. Rather than telling people how to act, you demonstrate the behavior that you want them to follow and how you want them to act. Now, if you are a leader within your organization, a leader within your team, then you might be doing this without even knowing. Because people instinctively look at what others are doing, people look up to people that manage them and lead them, and they see the way in which they act. And the way in which their leaders act is going to have an impact on how they act. If you do something, they're going to think that is how to act. If you have a go at someone in front of everyone and it causes a bit of drama, then they're going to think that is okay, that is acceptable, that's how we do things here, that affects the culture. So you might be doing it without even knowing, and the example you're setting might not necessarily be good. So it's an important thing for you to do is to reflect on yourself, reflect on how you lead, reflect on the image that you portray, and consider how you come across. And if you change your behavior, then you are going to lead by example. You are going to set a different standard for people to follow. If you want people to be considerate and positive, then act considerate and positive. Make sure you are always considerate and positive around everyone, and that behavior will rub off on others. And it's really important to be a good leader, and it's really important part of being a good leader by leading by example and demonstrating an example for others to follow. So let's tie it back to these characteristics that we've been building on throughout these video series. And start by looking at being a visionary. Part of being a good leader is being a visionary, being able to create a vision. And if you lead by example, then you can gain the respect, the trust of your team. They're more likely to commit to a vision if you are living and breathing that vision. If you're just telling them, we've got to get here, and that's probably a good idea, then they're not going to follow you. But if you are really living out that vision and you are marching towards that vision yourself, then you're going to bring them with you. Same with being motivating and being inspiring as well. If you want your team to work really, really hard, to really work towards getting that goal hit, then you need to work really hard. If you're constantly rolling up to work at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and then leaving at 3 o'clock and you're spending half the time talking and chatting and playing solitaire on your computer, then you're not going to motivate your staff to work really hard. You've got to put the hours in, you've got to put the time in if you want your team to put the hours, to put the time in. So leading by example also helps you to motivate your team to work hard and also to make them feel supported as well. Because if you are leading by example and you are being supporting, then they will feel supported, they will feel valued, meaning they're more likely to be motivated to work hard for both you and the rest of the team. With regards to being decisive, now leading by example doesn't fit in with critical thinking, idea generation, problem solving to quite the same extent as some of the others do, but the actions that you want your team to basically do, the things you want them to do, the attitude you want them to have, is dependent on you being decisive. If you want people to work really hard, you have to work really hard, because then you are demonstrating exactly the value, exactly the attitude that they need to have. So you do need to be decisive with regard to how you come across. You can't flip-flop from sometimes being supportive, sometimes not being supportive, etc. If you want to proactively develop your team, you want to proactively get them to behave in a certain way, then you need to be decisive in how you behave. And then with responsible and being a responsible leadership, installing the correct ethical behaviors, the right social behaviors, the right characteristics, the right traits, etc. That's very important. Remember, the impact that you have on your team comes from you. So if you want to lead by example, you have to lead in the right way. If you are unethical, if you do not act appropriately, they are going to pick up on that. They themselves are going to be acting inappropriately. They themselves are going to be acting unethically. So it's very, very important that you take on board how you come across and how that can impact the other members of your team. So it's quite a simple concept, leading by example, but it can be very, very effective. And it's something that you will have a lot of direct control over. It's simply your own attitude, your own behaviors that you're setting. So let's take a look at how this would work in the workplace using a step-by-step example. And as we go through these steps, we're going to look at a manager within a customer service team. And they want to set a good example to their team on how to act. So this is our customer service manager. And how are they actually going to enact this? How are they actually going to lead by example? Well, the first step is to actually establish what behaviors you want your team to achieve. And once you've established that, you can then consciously decide the kinds of behaviors you want your staff to emulate in order to achieve that vision of what that team looks like. And this can be for specific projects, or it can be an overall vision of the team as well. Ultimately, how you want your team to act in all circumstances. So, for example, with the customer service manager, perhaps they want their staff to be far more positive, far more enthusiastic in their work, particularly when they're dealing with customers. And so what the manager of that team will then need to do is always be positive, always be enthusiastic themselves, so that that rubs off on the staff members. And once the manager has decided what they want to achieve, they'll need to move on to the next step, which is to create rules for achieving that aim and sticking to them. And this is a really practical way of using leading by example as an effective leadership tool. Essentially, you set a series of expectations for your team and also to yourself. Now, it's very, very important that you apply these rules to you equally as well. You don't want to be hypocritical, because that can be a source of confusion, and it can also be a source of frustration that can lead to your team actually distrusting you. Going back to what I said earlier about the celebrities that were flying all around the world in private planes to talk about climate change. That comes across as hypocritical and therefore actually dilutes the message. Even though their message is still as important, it's diluted if it's coming from someone that is seen as hypocritical. So you must act how you want your staff to act. You must practice what you preach, just like Gandhi said. An ounce of practice is worth tons of preaching. So always make sure that you yourself stick to them. So, for example, thinking about our customer service manager that wants their team to be happy, to be enthusiastic all the time, they'll need to emulate that as well. They'll need to make sure that they themselves are always being happy, always being enthusiastic, and perhaps criticizing themselves if they are not. So, for example, if they were to lose their temper at one particular point, they would then say, I apologize to everyone, I shouldn't have done that. That's not how I want to behave. That's not how I would want you to behave, and I'm really sorry. And that can somewhat mitigate that issue if people are looking at them and saying, well, it's okay for them to get angry. Why is it not okay for me to get angry? So that's the rules that you need to create and stick with. And then once you have created those rules, you need to work alongside your team to make sure they are put into practice effectively. And this demonstrates equality as well. If you are working with them, you're not just giving them instructions, etc. That's going to demonstrate that you yourself value and respect what everyone else is doing if you're working with them all the time and you are promoting that vision that you want to achieve for the team, and you're working with everyone to help them promote that vision for the team. And that will make sure they respect you, make sure it encourages them to follow you. And another example of how you can achieve this is by giving direct examples of what they should be doing. So, for example, you might say to them that if you're working in the customer service team, for example, you might perhaps take over some customer calls and say, okay, here's how I would deal with this customer here. If they're having this kind of issue, here is how I would approach them. Here is what I would say. I'll take over this call. You just sit and watch me and follow what I do. Because not only is that showing them what to do, it's also demonstrating your willingness to help as well, which is also going to build trust. And also providing practical examples. So perhaps when you're instructing people, you could say, I remember a tale of when I was dealing with this customer and they were angry, and so I said this to them and I said that to them, and then we worked it out and we came to a positive arrangement. And therefore you're giving stories, you're giving examples of how this has benefited in the past, and that in turn is also going to be something that people take on board, people learn, and they will then themselves be able to act like that in the future. So you're still promoting that positive behavior. But as a leader, you do need to be accountable, and you do need to make sure you listen to feedback, listen to anything that your team have to say. And this is quite similar to the previous step. We're talking about working alongside your team, but it's a useful step in establishing the respect from your team. In order for them to follow you, in order for them to follow your example, they need to respect you. If they think you're untrustworthy, they think you are disrespectful, you don't value their input, they're not likely to copy you because they're not likely to look up to you, they're not likely to respect you, and therefore they'll want to not be like you rather than be like you. And so listening to what they're saying, taking on board their feedback is a really good way of evaluating your own mistakes and also improving your ability to be an effective leader and your ability to lead by example. So, for example, if a member of your team is disappointed by how you were acting, they said that, oh, you're supposed to always be positive and enthusiastic, and you weren't being positive and enthusiastic in that situation. I don't think you should have done that. Perhaps they'll say that you weren't following your own rules there. Rather than saying, who are you to tell me that, etc., you say, yes, you're right, and I completely apologize. I wouldn't expect that behavior from you, and I shouldn't expect that behavior from myself either, and I will work on that. I'll make sure I'm not doing that in the future. And so it will help you to improve. And that's ultimately what this is all about, is becoming a better leader and leading more effectively. And remembering that everything you do has an impact on your team, has an impact on your organization. So if you are acting in a way that you would not like your leader, your manager to act, then you need to change, because that's exactly what the people you are leading, the people you are managing are going to think of you if you do not improve. So how does this apply to financial leadership? Well, that's what we're going to look at now, because leading by example is very important, an important concept for everyone in every industry. It's not just for people like Gandhi, etc. It also relates to how you work within your organization. So we're going to look at an example here within the finance department, within a company, and also within a practice. So starting by looking at a financial controller. What does leading by example mean to a financial controller? Now, of course, the financial controller is a very, very senior figure within the organization's finance function. They'll be overseeing the various different departments within the finance team. There'll be managers and leaders reporting to the financial controller. So they do have a lot of influence over the organization, over the mindsets of people within the finance function. So it's very, very important, particularly if you have more influence, that you portray yourself in a better light, that you are always acting how you want everyone within the organization to act. Because if the financial controller of a finance department is lazy, they are argumentative and aggressive, and they don't work hard and all these sorts of things, then you're basically saying that the entire department doesn't need to work hard, doesn't need to be considerate and positive, etc. Because the most senior person or the most senior people within that department is not like that. So a financial controller might want to set an example for managers by getting them to act in a certain way during a strategy setting meeting. Now, rather than have lots of people talking over each other and interrupting and shooting down each other's ideas, the financial controller might say, okay, let's go around and everyone's got a certain amount of time to put their point across, and we can all take those ideas on board. Now, if the head of that meeting, the financial controller, etc., is effectively leading that meeting and is allowing everyone to have a say, then that's setting a precedent for how they expect other managers to act when they're dealing with their own teams. So if the financial controller is in a meeting with the head of the treasury, the head of the finance, the head of cash flow, or whatever it may be, just lots of different managers within the finance function, etc., if they are being supportive of everyone in that meeting, if they are allowing everyone to say something, they're allowing everyone to get their point across, then those different managers will in turn go and act like that with the rest of their team as well, because they'll be mimicking their behavior. Now, if you were working as an external audit manager, perhaps there's a slightly smaller range of influence here, particularly if you were just with a small team of auditors. You're not necessarily dealing with a much larger portion of the organization. You're just dealing with the client's accounts, etc. So you have a much smaller range of influence than a financial controller would within an organization. But you still have a very, very important job, and ultimately that job is about satisfying the needs of the clients. And the clients, of course, require you to be very accurate, and you have to have a lot of compliance and make sure all the financial statements are correct and accurate and such. So a way that an external auditor could use themselves as an example to junior auditors within the team is to show them how to fill out the reports in an appropriate way, show them how to deal with the clients and to answer questions from the clients in an appropriate way as well, and also just show a willingness to work alongside all the junior auditors as well, rather than barking orders down at them. So again, you are acting as an equal in the same way Gandhi was. You are not just their boss, you are their colleague, you are their equal, you are working with them, you want to help them. It's not just a case about trying to maintain some kind of strict hierarchy. And another way that an external audit manager might lead by example is to show interpersonal skills as well. Now, audits often can be quite intrusive. You might need to access a lot of private information, a lot of sensitive information, and it's very important that you maintain a good working relationship with your clients. And as auditors are often the first point of contact with clients, the audit manager must show them that they can listen, show them that they can empathize and act appropriately. So in the same way, the senior audit managers need to be demonstrating this in front of the junior audit managers so as to train them and as to lead by example as well. This is the way that at this audit firm, this is how we conduct ourselves with our clients, and this is the way that you should be conducting yourself with the client. And when you become a senior auditor, when you're in my position, this is how you will be conducting it yourself. So now let's look at an example, put into practice what we have learned in this section. And we've got an exercise here, and we're going to read through this, and then we're going to look at some potential things that the manager in question in this example can do. So let's read through the question together. So Timmy is the manager of a medium-sized organization's accounts receivable team. They have a team of 6 staff members, and together these 6 staff members are responsible for tracking payments from suppliers, negotiating late payments, and completing monthly reports on performance. Now, Timmy believes that the team are competent, hard workers, but they seem reluctant to help each other out when the team is struggling. So when the team's struggling, they're all working for themselves rather than helping each other out. And one of the main reasons for this as well is because there's a difficulty in obtaining late payments from customers, adding it to the workload. And so Timmy wants to lead by example, and so he employs the following actions. He begins reading management books on employing empathy when working with the team. He also offers to work with his team on tasks if he finishes early, and dedicates his time to discuss each team member's monthly workload to find out whether he can help them meet their deadlines and better manage these issues in the future. And the question I've got for you here is, based on this information, which of the following would be the best ways for Timmy to improve his team's team working and ability to meet deadlines through leading by example? And so let's take a look at these options. The first one is that Timmy could set a better precedent for the hard work expected by working late to ensure month-end deadlines are met. So he himself going to be working later to make sure that other people are motivated to work later, etc. He should encourage his team to read the same empathy books as he has been doing in their spare time. That he can set an example by incorporating team player and flexible when meeting deadlines into appraisals and score each member of the team on these factors. And finally, Timmy should choose a new goal for leading by example, as improving teamwork skills and the ability to meet deadlines is not an appropriate goal for an accounts receivable team. So what I would like you to do now is pause the video, Think back to the question, think back to this whole section, everything we've been discussing about leading by example, and then select which one of these would be the best way for Timmy to improve his team's team working ability by leading through example. So pause the video, take a look at that, and come back and we'll go through the solution together. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at each of these options. So the first one here, Timmy could set a better precedent for the hard work expected by working late to ensure month-end deadlines are hit. Now, this is a good way of leading by example. So although Timmy is already setting a good example through his actions by offering to help his team meet deadlines, working late is another way because it will encourage others to work late and to meet deadlines. It would, in a sense, set an expectation that Timmy expects his team to meet deadlines, and if they fall behind schedule, that they will work harder, they'll work later to achieve it. It also demonstrates that he's prepared to do more than his fair share of the work. So it gives off a good idea of what is expected and also helps to build trust with the manager, with Timmy, and also that it demonstrates that he is willing to support his team, he values his team, he wants his team to hit those goals. The second option was for Timmy to encourage his teams to read the same books that he is doing in their spare time. Now, whilst this is setting a positive example in that it does show that he's expecting his team to work on personal development and how to improve and become a better team player, a more effective use of Timmy's time, or a more effective action, would be for him to apply what he's learnt in the workplace. Just getting everyone else to read the same books isn't in itself going to be leading by example. It's just encouraging them to learn some stuff out for themselves. So whilst it's not a bad idea, it's not really setting an example. Timmy should be setting the example if he's going to lead by example. So he needs to take that knowledge and apply it, and for other people to see him making practical use of that knowledge rather than just getting them to read the same material. The third option, Timmy can set an example by incorporating team player and flexible when meeting deadlines into appraisals and scoring them on these factors. Now, these metrics would encourage the team to be more flexible, would encourage them to be more helpful because they would get a score in their appraisals, etc. But it's not actually, again, an example of him leading by example. It would establish expectations, but if he himself is not being graded and appraised on whether he's a team player and whether he is being flexible when meeting deadlines, then he's not embodying these expectations. He's not leading by example. He would need to be bound by those own expectations if he wanted others to follow them, if he was trying to lead by example. And finally, Timmy should choose a new goal for leading by example, as improving teamwork skills and the ability to meet deadlines is not an appropriate goal for an accounts receivable team. Well, team working and meeting goals is pretty much a good target for almost any team in any department in any industry. So it's still true of an accounts receivable team. So it's not a good idea because these are useful skills to have. That one is just completely wrong. It's always going to be important within a group, within a team, within a department to work on your team working skills and actually meet the deadlines that you have been set. And the final thing I'd like you to do is to now visit your workbooks and consider your own leadership and how you've managed your teams in the past, and think about whether you, either deliberately or not, have led by example. If you were trying to lead by example, what were you trying to achieve? What were you trying to do by setting that example? And what was the actual outcome of it? Also, if you have tried to lead by example, if you've set rules for your team, do you yourself follow those rules? and what impact you think your attitude to group expectations has on your team members. And finally, have your attempts to lead by example been successful? And if not, what do you think has stopped them from being successful? And how could you change your approach for the better in the future? So do take a look at those questions, fill out your workbooks and keep that as a reflective journal, and also make sure you try to implement the learnings from it in the workplace so that you can act as a more effective leader. You can lead by example more effectively. And that brings us to the end of this section and also the end of this video. I hope you have a good idea now of what it means to lead by example, how it can help you to become a more effective leader. And remember to implement those step-by-step approaches as well. So think about what you're actually trying to achieve by setting an example. Make sure you set appropriate ground rules as well, and that you yourself stick by them, and that you allow for feedback and you work with your team in order to make sure you ultimately achieve that vision of what you were trying to achieve by leading by example. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and please join me for the next one.